Nigeria has a huge capital base in terms of mineral resources, up to $1 trillion in resources. And yet, depending on how you measure it, 50 to 70% of its people live in poverty. And so this conundrum between huge resources and extremely poor outcomes is often an indicator that the public sector is inefficient, it's unproductive, it can't transform wealth into welfare outcomes. I'm interested in the direct forms of interference that politicians can have in bureaucracies. And the natural two margins that an economist might think about are delegation. Who amongst all of the organisations a politician can choose in the bureaucracy do they choose? And engagement. That's slightly harder to understand in an economics context. Thinking about public organisations, the contracting structure is very rigid. It's very difficult to change the formal contract of a bureaucrat. And so politicians have to go and directly engage with bureaucrats and give them incentives, perhaps in the form of punishments, but also in the form of bribes, rewards. Very little data actually records whether public projects get done and to what quality or not. But Nigeria did something very unique after debt relief. So it received some debt relief, and the president said, I'm going to put a monitoring system in that records how effectively 10% of our budget, that funded by debt relief, is expended. I'm going to, as a few people in the Nigerian government used to say, we're going to pass water through a hose to see where the holes are. We're going to put these resources through mainstream organisations of government and see where the money gets lost. So what they did was they brought together independent engineers who had nothing to do with the projects, nothing to do with government, and civil society into coherent teams. So that meant civil society groups, NGOs, were working with government. And these groups went out together to go and check what had happened to the project. That was the foundation of my work, that we had a snapshot of public sector productivity, but that wasn't enough, because what we need to know is what determines the variation that we see. So I went and I'd worked in Nigeria through something called the Overseas Development Institute program. I'd been sent there as an economist to work in the presidency. So I went to talk to the special assistant to the president and said, why don't we go and survey all the organisations that implemented these projects? And that will give us a sense of what the different officials, what their experience of service delivery is like and how they're managed and so on. That wasn't enough, because we need to know about the politicians. So I'd hand-coded the documents, 21,000 documents of the open implementation. I'd run the surveys across the civil service, and now I went to the political records of all the politicians in the Senate and the House, and for every single one created biographies. Political competition does seem to discipline politicians, that it pushes them to delegate to the most effective organisations and to enforce their own engagement, their own informal contracts. So the difference between a centralised organisation, which is the least effective, and the decentralised, the most effective, and that's the choice that I'm studying, increases project completion rates by 30%. So that means that, imagine you've got projects that can be between 0 and 100% completed. The delegation decision increases projects by about something like 30%, and given that only 50% of projects are ever completed, we're explaining about 60% of project completion there. And then engagement seems to have slightly smaller effects, but it's very heterogeneous. So it's very sensitive to political competition. So when someone is facing a lot of political competition, there is actually a huge effect. People engage with real fervour and gusto, because they know that every vote counts and public goods are a direct way of getting those votes. And that seems to tail off quite quickly. I think what we see is that politicians can be a force for good in government, as well as can retard government's productivity. And we want to emphasise and facilitate the positive aspects of politicians' influence and limit the negative aspects of it. And one way that we've, in the literature, in the economics literature, started to think about this is scorecards. And so every constituent is sent a few weeks before the election a scorecard, non-partisan, only giving details from a credible source of what that politician has provided in terms of public goods. And then what happens is the politician is highly incentivized to provide public goods because they know that that scorecard will go out just before the election every 4 years or whatever, and they'll be judged on that. And so that will really emphasize their role in the provision of public goods, in engaging positively with the bureaucracy. But it remains uncertain that we can go inside legislators and create constitutional limits or other limits on politician behaviour, because it's politicians who have to make those decisions. So are politicians really going to constrain themselves? Are they really going to tie their own hands? What I think we have to do is one of two things. Either we have to make it a big public policy issue, that we as citizens have to go and determine what we think should tie politicians' hands and then force the hand, make it electorally a big issue, so that any politician who promises to do that, and maybe does so credibly, gets our vote. And so they gain in the short term from our long-term benefit. I think secondly, we need to start thinking of creative and imaginative ways to create these constraints on politician behaviour from the grassroots up. And so far that's been very challenging. I think if you think of how democracies have formed, it's been a series of quite big clashes between elites and non-elites. I think now we can communicate better, we can form alliances much more easily. What we need to start thinking about is how do we discipline politicians in a way that's going to mean that our future's better than it could otherwise have been.